Big news for anyone who loves the history of D-Day. Matt McLachlan Battlefield Tours has just launched a brand new tour that visits the D-Day beaches and lots of other sites in rural France, and all from the comfort of a luxurious cruise on the Seine River. Now, we ran this tour in 2024 and it was a huge success. It sold out in a matter of weeks. So now we've rolled it out again for 2025. But this time, there'll be 3 departures in June, July and September, giving you 3 times the opportunity to join us. The cruise is on board the luxurious Amadeus Diamond and begins and ends in Paris. Over 8 days, you'll enjoy the history, scenery and culture of the beautiful Seine River. But as an exclusive offering just for our passengers, you'll enjoy 2 full days touring the D-Day landing beaches in both the US and British sectors, plus daily seminars on board the ship that unpack the history of D-Day. And like all our tours, you'll be hosted by one of our expert historians who'll bring the story of D-Day to life. And if you've been on one of our tours before, you'll know that our historians really are the best there is. This is an exclusive cruise and places are extremely limited. Visit battlefields.com.au to book your place today.
When it comes to weight loss, no 2 people are the same. That's why Noom builds personalized plans based on your unique psychology and biology. Take Brittany. After years of unsustainable diets, Noom helped her lose 20 pounds and keep it off.
I was definitely in a yo-yo cycle for years of just losing weight, gaining weight, and it was exhausting.
And Stephanie. She's a former D1 athlete who knew she couldn't outtrain her diet, and she lost 38 pounds.
My relationship to food before Noom was never consistent.
And Evan, he can't stand salads, but he still lost 50 pounds with Noom.
I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. Even through the pickiness, Noom taught me that building better habits builds a healthier lifestyle. I'm not doing this to get to a number. I'm doing this to feel better.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom users compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
I have a secret. I used to struggle with dull, saggy skin. Then I found Spoiled Child's E27 liquid collagen. This extra strength liquid formula, packed with type 1 and type 3 collagen, vitamin C, and hyaluronic acid, makes it so easy to visibly transform your skin and hair. No more chunky collagen powders, just a smooth, delicious liquid that can be blended with any drink. With over 100,000 5-star reviews, this liquid collagen is going viral for a reason. And with their try before you buy offer, you could try your full-size product at home before buying. Take the quiz at spoiledchild.com/quiz. That's spoiledchild.com/quiz.
A Living History production.
I'm Matt McLachlan.
And I'm Pete Smith.
We're battlefield historians who love nothing better than getting out and walking the ground where great battles in history took place.
And now we'd like you to come with us. Every week, BattleWalks will take you to one of the great battlefields of Europe.
As we walk the ground, we'll dig through the pages of history. We'll uncover the secrets of the battlefields, and most importantly, we'll tell the stories of the people who fought and died there.
Welcome to BattleWalks.
Hello and welcome again to BattleWalks, where we're walking across the great battlefields of Europe. Thank you to everyone who has joined us recently. We've had an influx of new listeners over recent weeks, and it's been really great to see. It's really good to see that Pete and I aren't just strolling around the battlefields on our own. We do it because we love sharing these adventures with you. So thank you for joining us, and thank you to everyone who responds and gives us feedback through Twitter, through Facebook, through all the channels, because it's great to hear from you. And as always, keep sending in your suggestions for battlefields you'd like to see, because we're always looking for good ideas. And the man with all the good ideas is my co-host joining me today, Pete. Welcome back to the show.
I like that. All the good ideas. Yeah, thank you. Yes, it's great to be with you again.
Well, it would be false if people didn't have the impression that most of the ideas we come up with for this show are your suggestions, Pete, being there on the battlefields. And I have to say, your suggestion for last week, Operation Jericho, was absolutely inspired. It was if you haven't listened to that one, go out and listen to it, because the raid on Amiens prison in 1944, a bizarre chapter in many ways, and just a really interesting one to cover from the ground.
Yeah, and I've got a few more up my sleeve yet.
Excellent. We had a really good response to that episode last week, Pete. A lot of people sent messages just saying how much they enjoyed it. And I mean, it is a good one, isn't it? It's an unusual one. I like these interesting little chapters of the Second World War that we can uncover. Sometimes we uncover little chapters of the First World War, but mostly the Second World War. But it was a good one to be able to walk around Army on, and right in your neck of the woods.
It is, and that's what I like. When it's close, I can go and have a quick shifty at it, make sure nothing's changed as well. There's nothing worse than talking about something and it's actually changed. So yeah, the prison is still there, and anybody passing that way can have a look.
Well, if you haven't listened to that, go back and definitely listen to it, because it was quite an exciting episode. I really enjoyed making it. And today we're going to return to the First World War. But before we do that, a couple of exciting housekeeping announcements. Firstly, this is the main one. The COVID situation in Australia seems unrelenting. Thank God we've done a good job of battling the virus, but what it's meant is we now are effectively closed off to the rest of the world like we have been for over a year. And that doesn't seem like it's going to change anytime in the future. So sadly, if you're an Australian, we won't be walking the battlefields for quite a while. But I get the feeling that's not the same for our UK brothers and sisters. So if you are from the UK, an exciting announcement. Matt McLachlan Battlefield Tours is coming back this summer in France. We are going to operate battlefield tours of the Western Front with Pete Smith this summer. As soon as they allow UK people to travel unrestricted to France, we will be back there operating tours of the Western Front, Normandy, pretty much all the destinations we talk about in this podcast, and I cannot tell you how excited I am about it. Pete, you must be looking forward to it as well.
I'm even more excited. So it'll be absolutely fantastic to take people around the battlefields in real life. So I'm thrilled and looking forward to it immensely.
And I say, as a listener, what a brilliant opportunity. I mean, you've heard Pete on this podcast, just his breadth of knowledge, his humanity, his ability to bring the history to life. But the chance to actually get out and walk the battlefields with him is just extraordinary. I've had the privilege of doing it several times, and it's amazing. And so I'm just really excited. It's watch this space, because obviously there's a few things that have to be lined up. But we will be launching those tours as well very soon, with the expectation that as soon as the borders open up, as soon as you're allowed to travel unrestricted between the UK and France, we will be able to operate those tours of France. So it's very, very exciting. So it's going to be on our website, which will be battlewalks.co.uk, because it'll be closely aligned with everything we're doing on the podcast. But it's really exciting. So if you're in the UK, and of course if you're in Canada or North America or anywhere else that is allowed to travel to France, you're welcome to join us as well. But I think particularly our friends in the UK will be very excited about this, that hopefully within a month or so, we will be back touring on the battlefields. We're just so excited. So absolutely look out for that one and join us. Pete, you'll be doing First World War battlefields, Second World War battlefields. Is there one you're most looking forward to getting back to with passengers?
Well, I think up to Ypres and into Belgium onto the salient, it seems such a long time. Well, it is such a long time. It's 18 months or more since I've been into Belgium, and a place that I went weekly. So not to be able to go and cover the battlefields of the First World War in Belgium. I mean, the battlefields here I can actually walk to and I can drive to, so I still visit those, but I haven't been over the border now for 18 months. So looking forward to getting back into Belgium.
So we'll make an announcement when those tours are live, but the website will be up very soon. You'll be able to see exactly what we'll be offering, but it'll be under battlewalks.co.uk. And as I said, watch this space. It's very, very exciting. Another housekeeping thing which is exciting is Apple has just introduced Apple subscriptions, which means if you listen on an Apple device, as the vast majority of our listeners do, you will be able to subscribe. And this is really exciting because there's always so much more we want to talk about that we don't get a chance to talk about in the podcast. And so there'll be exclusive content available for subscribers. So for a small monthly fee, you will be able to join us and effectively get an extra episode a week. We will do an extra episode just for subscribers on BattleWalks, and also on our sister podcast, Pete and Gary's Military History. We'll be doing it over there as well. So if you listen to any of the podcasts that we do, basically for a small fee every month, you will get a bonus episode of both podcasts. It's going to be really exciting. We're really looking forward to it. So again, look out for that on Apple Podcasts. You'll see that button pretty soon saying that you can subscribe and get some bonus content. It'll also be completely ad-free. We'll do some special events just for subscribers. I'm really looking forward to it. Because, Pete, we as much talking as we do, there's always something more to say. It's going to be great when we get a chance to do some bonus episodes just for those subscribers.
I can go off on one of my tangents, and I can stick on it, which is great.
We could call it Pete's Tangents. It could just be a whole episode of tangents. We can see how far away from the starting point we can get.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it. It is going to be lighthearted. It's going to be fairly relaxed. It's going to be a good one-on-one chance to just hear a little bit more about what we enjoy doing on the battlefields. And yeah, if you have ever felt the need to sit next to Pete and I in a pub over a beer and just hear what we waffle on about, this is probably a good opportunity. It's going to be really great. So we're very excited about the extra content we can bring with subscriptions. So look out for that one as well. Well, Pete, shall we get on with what we're doing this week? Because it's a pretty exciting one. We're heading back to Gallipoli. I think, especially for Australians and New Zealanders, just iconic. For British people as well. And I'm glad to see Gallipoli is getting some more prominence in the UK because it really deserves to.
I think it's always been prominent, but it gets overlooked because I suppose of the interest. If you're interested in Gallipoli, then people are interested and they want to go. But you're right. If you went to your average Joe Public and said, do you know about the Gallipoli landings? And they may do. If you've got no interest in history, you probably wouldn't. But if you've got no interest in history, you probably would know about the Battle of the Somme. So yes, I can see what you mean, that it has been kind of forgotten, but it's. I think it's a very important part of the campaigns of the First World War, and one that certainly, I have to say, it's one of my favourite places to go. So it's a joy to be doing this podcast, and such a shame that I haven't been since 2016. So I've not visited since 2016. When was the last time you went, Matt?
Well, that's a good question. I think I was there in 2019 with Peter Hart, just before the whole COVID.
Oh yes, I was very jealous. I remember
adventure occurred. Yeah, actually, we did on Living History. Pete and I did a whole series of podcasts. This is Peter Hart, the other Pete in my life. We did a whole series of podcasts live from Gallipoli, which was very exciting. It was in 2019. So yeah, that was the last time I was there. But gee, I walked every inch of it. It's funny as we were talking about the national perspective on Gallipoli, Pete, because there's a bit of an irony there that perhaps in the UK it hasn't received the attention it's deserved, especially for the UK contribution. 30,000 men killed or wounded at Gallipoli. No, 30,000 killed. In extraordinary numbers. And then it perhaps has been a little bit overlooked in the UK because of everything that was happening in France and Belgium. And it was the exact opposite in Australia and New Zealand, that Gallipoli dominated our consciousness so much that what we did on the Western Front got overlooked. And I'm happy to say that both of those have been redressed, that the British seem to have discovered the importance of Gallipoli, and the Aussies and New Zealanders have discovered that the whole story of the First World War is not just Gallipoli.
I can feel another podcast coming on, because there is a forgotten front that is almost totally forgotten, and that's Salonika. In fact, most people don't even know exactly where Salonika actually is. Salonika is the real forgotten front of the First World War, along with Italy, I suppose, another front that Britain was fighting on. So Salonika and Italy, I can feel two podcasts coming on there.
I agree, and many, of course, on the British sector of Gallipoli, because there's so much to explore. As we've said before, when we did Gallipoli very early on, I think it was maybe our second episode we did, maybe our first episode, but that was the last time we touched on Gallipoli, 25 odd episodes ago, and we said it then that the joy of visiting Gallipoli is it's virtually unchanged. Because it's rough country, because the terrain was such an obstacle, so much of it, particularly in the Anzac sector, is just unchanged. You can read an account of we walked up McLachlan's Ridge, and you can walk up that ridge yourself. You then look down over Monash Gully. You can walk down to Shrapnel Gully. You can climb up the slopes up to Quinn's Post or up to the Neck. It's just extraordinary that all these iconic places are still there. They're still obvious, and you can walk between them. Just an incredible place. You can't say too much about how wonderful it is to walk the ground at Gallipoli, especially as we're doing now, because we are out walking the ground, and that's what you should do when you go to Gallipoli. Don't do it. The majority of tourists just do it on a bus or in a car. Get out and walk the ground. It's absolutely extraordinary.
Absolutely essential. It is the most wonderful battlefield to walk, because it is unchanged in the main. There are some big exclusions to that, but in the main it is unchanged. And I can't think of another battlefield, or certainly the ones that I've visited in Europe, that are unchanged. They're completely changed. I mean, here we have ploughed fields, and I'm describing actions in ploughed fields that are back under the plough. And Gallipoli, the Gallipoli Peninsula, just extraordinary.
I remember the first time we went there together, Pete, in about 2013, and walking around Hill 60, which is a site that is an interesting part of the story, but doesn't often resonate with people compared to some of the other places. But for whatever reason, it was a perfect day. We were walking around. I think we were even there on the anniversary of the battle, but we were walking around. And as we strolled around, I remember I looked down and found a rounded 303 bullet, the type they used at Gallipoli, that rather than the pointy 303 projectile, it was the rounded nose. And so I bent down and picked that up. And then under a little tree, there were 3 little fragments of a Turkish cricket ball grenade, or 3 perfectly formed little iron fragments. And the Turks have called it Hill 60 Bomber Cert, which is Bomb Hill, because of the amount of hand grenades that were thrown around there. And to find fragments of a Turkish cricket ball bomb at Hill 60 was just extraordinary. So we could go on and on about the magic of the place. It's quite extraordinary.
I probably spoilt it a little bit because I left my glasses there. They fell off my head at some stage, so somebody's probably found my glasses now on that very day.
a relic of the fighting. It's changed the outlook on what was going on in 1915. But today we're going to do something in the Australian-New Zealand sector. We're going to do, for Australians and New Zealanders, the most iconic part of the battlefield. That's the landing beaches, the story of the landing, obviously the essential part in most people's minds. An interesting one for me because I think it gets a little bit too much attention. Our understanding of the landing, I think, focuses too much. It's why last year I did that book with Peter Hart on the Gallipoli evacuation, because I thought that was just as a compelling part of the story as the landing. But the landing gets a lot of attention. And the landing area is about so much more than Anzac Cove. So that's what we're going to do today, a walk along the whole stretch of beaches that cover the landings. And we're going to tell the story of the landings. Well, I'm not going to go into too much detail. I think everyone knows the stories of the landings, but we'll touch on a couple of the features. But the first thing to note about the landings was it was unopposed, effectively unopposed, that there was only one half company of Turks overlooking the beaches where the Anzacs came ashore. So in the opening hour or so of the landing, when the Australians landed, the New Zealanders came in a second wave, but in the first wave that landed of Australians, they put ashore about 4,000 troops in the first hour or so, and opposing them were less than 150 Turkish troops. So that's the first thing to understand. They had no machine guns, they only had rifles, and they did not stick around, because if you were one of 150 blokes and you saw 4,000 people landing from boats, you would get out of there pretty quickly, which is exactly what the Turks did. So they did fire some shots, they did kill some Australians, but absolutely not many at all. The one thing to remember about the Gallipoli landing is the killing and the dying occurred later in the day, on the 25th of April. Thousands of people died on the opening day of the Gallipoli campaign, but it mostly occurred later in the day as the fighting stretched to the ridges and gullies overlooking the landing beaches, not on the beaches themselves. It's an interesting one, isn't it, Pete? Because even artists of the time, during the war, when artists painted, portraits of the landing at Gallipoli, the number of times you see explosions, it looks like something out of Saving Private Ryan. Firstly, broad daylight. Secondly, machine guns blasting away, artillery carving up the beach. And it wasn't like that at all. It was in complete darkness, and it was virtually unopposed.
I think this is the big confusion, is people get confused with the landings that took place later on in the day compared to the initial landings. And it's very much often the case that the first waves go in unopposed because people are either not ready or not sure where people are going to land. So very often the first guys over the top on the Western Front very often do better than the second and third waves, because there's always an element of not sure what's going to happen. And so we get this confusion in people's minds, especially because it's been, I suppose, over the years, it's become such an important part of Australian culture that those landings on Anzac Day, as it will become known, and so people think that the first landings were where it was, really terrible, getting out of the boat, getting hit, falling in the water, machine guns opening up, and of course the machine guns are a massive issue in their own right. We know there were no machine guns there. We now for certain know that there were no machine guns on the initial landings. So it's a story that has become exaggerated, and we can see. I mean, I was a serviceman, and you have this terrible kind of need to make your service kind of feel like it should have been more exciting. Now, I didn't ever see any combat, but if I had done, then would I tend to exaggerate it? Well, I think there's a big, you can't help yourself really to a certain extent, and men over the years tell a story that gets exaggerated, it then gets written down, and they think, I can't tell the correct story now because now this is in print. So I think there's all of that. There's also the need for Australia. This is the coming of age of Australia. It means so much nowadays that we need to make it a little bit more exciting. Well, you don't need to. The whole story is massively exciting without exaggerating anything. But we have a little bit of an exaggeration on the actual the opposition to the original landings.
I think the other thing we should talk about is the landing in the wrong place story, which we'll get into as we explore this area. I should also say that the walk we're going to do is based on my book, Gallipoli, the Battlefield Guide. Pete and I each have a copy of that in front of us, and that's the tour we're basing this on. So if you have a copy of that book, grab it out and you can walk in the footsteps with us, because there is quite a lot to see in the landing beaches area, and it's a story much bigger than just Anzac Cove. But this idea of the landing in the wrong place is true. The Anzacs did come ashore in an area they were not supposed to. But a couple of things about it. It wasn't that they landed on the wrong beach. The Australians were always intended, some Australians were always intended to come ashore at Anzac Cove. It's just the problem was that they all bunched up and they all landed on Anzac Cove together. In reality, they were supposed to land on a front which was about a mile long, so about 1.5 kilometres. And there's three main beaches. There's Brighton Beach, what would be called by the Anzacs Brighton Beach, Anzac Cove, and then North Beach to the north. And the plan was that they were going to come ashore on a wide 1 mile front across all of those beaches and push inland. What actually happened was there was no mysterious current, there was no Turks moving marker buoys, none of this stuff. Basically, all that happened is as they came ashore in the dark, the Navy men driving them in got a little bit confused with the geography because it hadn't been accurately charted. They hadn't had much of a chance to reconnoitre. As they came ashore, they got a few of their landmarks confused, and some of the men in the south that were supposed to be heading towards Brighton Beach got a couple of the landmarks confused and started turning a little bit north. And of course, if you imagine a whole line of boats side by side, if the boat on your right starts swinging towards you, effectively, as the ones in the south started turning north, you're going to start swinging north as well. You're going to turn a little bit left to avoid a collision. And so basically what you have is a large number of boats that all started to swing north a little bit. And because of the layout of the geography, then they found themselves all getting bunched up between two massive headlands, and they all came ashore at Anzac Cove. So I think the other thing to say is that the plan was never very specific about where they would come ashore. The plan simply said they will land on a mile front between Brighton Beach and Arrow-Burnu, which is the northern end of Anzac Cove. So it was pretty vague to begin with. I think the important thing was that they just needed to get ashore, and the problem was that the big problem was the confusion of the landing, that all the battalions got mixed up. You know, a battalion might have been spread across 30 boats by the time you had all the men in a battalion coming ashore. They spread out between dozens and dozens of boats. Those boats all got very confused, and the men came ashore without their officers. They came ashore without other men from their battalions. And by the time it was all sorted out, that element of surprise had been lost. So does that sit with a fair summation in your mind, Pete, of the confusion of the landing?
Yeah, it does indeed. And it's odd. Where they landed was actually probably the safest bit on the whole section of that coastline, because these two little jutting out spears of land, Arrow-Burnu and Hell Spit, at each side of Anzac Cove, they gave that shelter, so you didn't get enfilade fire. There was no fire coming in from the sides in the main. A couple of exceptions, but for the initial landings, no fire really coming in from the side. So in a way, yes, they're not in the right spot, but they are in the right spot. It's just that they're all in the right spot. Everybody's all crammed in together. And as Matt quite rightly said, I think the biggest issue is the confusion of trying to get your battalion together, of trying to find your command, trying to find where your guns are and your machine guns. So that was the biggest issue, was that they were tasked to go straight up the bluffs, to head straight up to the high ground. And very difficult when you're not quite sure who you're with. Who is the guy beside me? Is he in my battalion? I have no idea who he is. In fact, I have no idea where I'm going. All I've been ordered is I need to go up. I need to start climbing. And I have to say now, for those of you that haven't been, you have got to go. It is absolutely stunning. When I went in 2013 was the first time that I actually had visited the site, and I remember standing at on the beach and looking up. And just thinking, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to read everything again, because it's just so steep. And even though I'd seen photographs and maps and plans, and I knew it backwards and forwards before I got there, but standing on that beach and looking up, it's just extraordinary how steep the landscape is, and how difficult it was going to be to fight in the dark. Because remember, this is dark. This is 4:30 in the morning. So many issues going on at the same time. And you have to say, it is no surprise that it starts to fall to bits. The other thing that is important, I think, to realise is that most of the men that were fighting on the beach had very limited information about what was going on. There wasn't, as there will be later on in the Great War, where there's going to be an individual infantryman will be briefed very well before he goes into action in 1918. He knows exactly who's in front of him, who's to the left, who's to the right, what he's supposed to do, the landmarks. They built models for him to look at. The briefing here for Joe Bloggs, the infantryman, was non-existent, you have to say.
We should also, a couple of important points to mention is that the Allies didn't just, come ashore and bungle about. They had to face a determined enemy. And the one thing we tend to always overlook from our Western perspective is the brilliant job the Turks did defending their homeland, as you can imagine. And the Turkish defence was exceptional at Gallipoli. Throughout the campaign, they fought at a standard that was much higher than anything that the sort of arrogant Allies expected them to. And so it wasn't the case that we just bumbled our way through the Gallipoli campaign. We were defeated by a determined enemy, and so we should note the job the Turks did, particularly on the first day. Stopping the waves from getting inland was essential to what happened for the rest of the campaign. It's just quite an extraordinary place, and we should never forget the job that the Turks did in the defence. Should we begin walking? It's a really interesting place. We're not going to start at Anzac Cove. We're going to start a little bit further north. At a place called North Beach, and it'll be worth getting a map out just to see where the Anzacs came ashore, because we're going to start at North Beach. The most prominent thing at North Beach now is the Anzac commemorative site, so we'll start there because there's the geographic feature known as the Sphinx, which is still there. This sort of jutting out. I think Les Carline called it an erosion in progress. It's this jutting out crop of land which towers over North Beach and looked inescapably like the Sphinx back in Egypt, where they'd been training. And now today in the shadow of the Sphinx is the purpose-built Anzac commemorative site to accommodate the thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of tourists that come for Anzac Day every year. And I want to talk a little bit about Anzac Day because my advice to you would be Anzac Day at Gallipoli is obviously iconic, particularly if you're an Australian or a New Zealander. And so absolutely go if being there for that service is important to you. It's a grueling adventure. You have to be up all night and walk many kilometres in the freezing cold and then in the boiling heat. It's actually quite grueling. I'm looking forward to never doing it ever again, having done it several times. But I feel I've done it now, and I think once is definitely enough. But what I would say to people is definitely go twice to Gallipoli if you can, because Anzac Day is an amazing national event, but it's also very, very crowded. When there's 10 or 20,000 other people there, you do not get the experience of Gallipoli, which so many of us know, which is the solitude. So if you are fortunate, go to Gallipoli twice, or at least go to Gallipoli for Anzac Day and then stay longer so that you have more time to explore, because it does tend to thin out very quickly after Anzac Day, and you hopefully get the place to yourself. Because, Pete, I've got to say, standing on these ridges and walking through these gullies where thousands and thousands of men tramped during the campaign, and then having the whole place to yourself is really quite an extraordinary experience.
It is indeed, and I think you have to choose the time of year that you're going to go. And oddly, Anzac Day is a great time to go because it can be quite warm during the day. It gets a bit chilly in the evenings, but the weather is perfect for exploring and wandering about. Whether later on in the year it can get very, very hot, and you need to make sure you've got buckets of water with you, even though you can go for a dip in the sea to cool yourself down if you're close to the coastline. But it can be very hot, and in the winter, of course, it's very cold, as we know from Peter Hart's podcast and the book about the evacuation. Very, very cold in the winter. So around about Anzac Day, best time to go. But I would go pre or post, have a really good look round, and do that walking and exploring and enjoying the battlefield, and then go somewhere else in Turkey. Go and explore one of the other historic sites. There are an awful lot. Or go to Istanbul, and then come back again and for the actual Anzac Day. Because Matt's right. Trying to combine the two in a very short period, in a couple of days, then it's quite difficult to visit all of the sites when there's all of the road blockages and things you get around services that take place on Anzac Day. Because of course the Turks also commemorate Anzac Day as well, so there's a lot of things going on. So definitely 2 trips, or a trip that's 2 visits within one trip.
Another point that I should have mentioned about the landing when we first started talking about it, that's something that will reflect why this was such a confused muddle. The example I always give when you stand on these beaches and talk about the Gallipoli landing is that D-Day. So Gallipoli was the largest amphibious landing up until that time, and it remained the case until the Second World War. So it forms some useful comparisons. And General Patton, for example, who played such a large role in D-Day in the Second World War, was an avid student of what went on at Gallipoli, and he learned a lot of lessons about the disaster that was Gallipoli. But if we look at D-Day, it took more than 2 years to plan the D-Day landings of 1944. The Gallipoli campaign was planned in 3 weeks. It was 3 weeks between the time that the Navy was defeated and they decided they needed a landing at Gallipoli. So they literally spent 3 weeks planning where they were going to come ashore and exactly how they were going to do it. And I think, Pete, given your military experience, given everything we know about history, an operation this large was never going to be effective with only 3 weeks of planning.
It's just extraordinary, especially when you know a little about the pre-planning for for Normandy in 1944, where they're taking samples. They sent frogmen ashore to take samples of the beach, the material on the beach, whether it was gravelly or whether it was soft sand or hard packed sand, that kind of information. They're gathering it in. They also wanted photographs of the beaches for people that were on holiday pre the Second World War, so they could kind of get up-to-date comparisons and views of high tide and low tide. So just unbelievably detailed planning. And here we have, well, very little planning. No idea of, I'm sure most of the guys were probably, were told they had to scramble inland and it's going to be a bit of a steep hill. But like myself, for the first time I'm on that beach and looking up, that is a little bit more than a steep hill. And it's you literally can't climb it in very many areas. So I think it's just extraordinary. The other thing I should say, if you'd rowed ashore on D-Day in 1944, you'd have had a problem as well, because what we didn't mention is these boats are not powering up the beach and dropping the ramp and out come the soldiers. These are literally being drawn in by lighters, 3 little boats, steam powered, bringing it up as close as they can, letting them free, and then the guys are having to row in, the last couple of 100 meters or more in some cases. So again, did they have lots and lots of practice at rowing before this took place? No, they didn't. And when you've got one of these lifeboats effectively having to row them in, difficult. There must have been blokes going all over the place. But so a difficult day, and thankfully, the initial landing was not under fire, because it would have gone horribly wrong right the way from the start if they had been.
All of the planning of the Gallipoli campaign just reeks of hubris, doesn't it, on the part of the Allies? The number one mistake they made was assuming that the Turks would not defend the ground very well. So everything about it was, it doesn't matter where we come ashore, Johnny Turk is not going to get in our way. It doesn't, the might of the British Empire will cast them aside pretty quickly. And the worst thing that actually happened to the Allies was one of their early successes. In November 1914, they bombarded some Turkish forts. They got very lucky and hit the magazine in one of the Turkish forts and blew it up entirely and killed hundreds of Turks. And the whole fort was aflame. And then they sent a raiding party ashore, and because the Turks were all dazed from the explosions, the raid was very successful. This was actually the worst thing that could happen to the Allies, because it meant from that moment they completely underestimated the ability of the Turks to defend their homeland. And I think that led to the debacle that became the Gallipoli landing.
And we have to remember as well, of course, the Germans were very much involved in training the Turkish army before the First World War. So, these guys have had good military training as well. Not all of them, but in general, the officers are well trained. They know their tactics, and so yeah, this is not a rabble that they're facing at all.
Isn't this the thing about Gallipoli, Pete? I mean, we've only just barely started talking about the walk that we're going to be doing, but already there's just so many layers of history, and that's the thing that with Gallipoli, there's always another angle, there's always another argument, there's always someone saying, well, if only we'd done this, if only we'd done that. Peter Hart calls it the if only campaign. If only we'd done this, if only the ships got through, if only we'd landed at a different spot, if only we'd put more troops onto that beach instead of that one. It could have all gone differently. There's so many if-onlys to do with the Gallipoli campaign, and I think you can see that just from the amount of discussion Pete and I are even having here just about the fundamentals of the landing. But let's actually walk the beaches. So as I said, we're at North Beach. We're under the shadow of the Sphinx. It's an iconic spot to stand. It's where the Anzac Day service is held every day. Anzac Day used to be held at Ari Burnu Cemetery, one of the prominent cemeteries at Anzac Cove, up until the late 90s. But it's a very small cemetery, and literally thousands and thousands of people were coming. It was in the 90s that Anzac Day really took off. the commemoration of it back in Australia, but also this idea that you should go to a foreign battlefield, which when you think about it is quite an interesting concept. It doesn't naturally fit. Americans, for example, are not going to Normandy in their hundreds of thousands to pay their respects, or to Iwo Jima, or to any of the great American battlefields. They're very happy to do it from the monuments back in America. Most countries are the same. The concept that you need to go to the battlefields and walk the ground and be there for these huge commemorative events is quite a recent thought. I'm very glad that Australians in particular do it, because it means that we get thousands of people committing to walk the battlefields. But at places like Gallipoli, it did put a lot of pressure on the landscape, which is why in 2000 they opened the Anzac commemorative site, a purpose-built area on North Beach to commemorate Anzac Day. So it's actually a bit confusing to people that they think they will be commemorating Anzac Day at Anzac Cove, but actually don't. They commemorate Anzac Day just around the corner at the commemorative site.
I think I'll just add something here, Matt, because it is very, very interesting. Of course, it almost became, and still is, I suppose, to a certain extent, a rite of passage for young Australians. Young Australians, they know about it. And I can't think of another country that has this equivalent, almost a rite of passage that you need to go. If you can afford it, and when you're touring Europe and as a backpacker, touring Europe, then you go to a battlefield. As part of your rite of passage, almost, you go to a battlefield and you commemorate what took place now over 100 years ago. And I think that's extraordinary, but it's also extraordinary that these are young people. Because certainly we don't get that here. We get school students coming to the battlefields of the Somme, but you wouldn't get backpackers here exploring the battlefields. So I think there's this rite of passage, but there's also one of the other interesting things I suspect is because the accommodation's cheap. The accommodation is quite cheap in Turkey, and in the area you can get you can hire a small room, or you can camp, or you can literally crash out. So there's lots of ways that you can see it very cheaply, and I think that's what also helps the fact that backpackers and young people were going on a regular basis, and still do, not at the moment, but go to the Gallipoli battlefields, and especially to Anzac Day. So it's very odd, and I think most Australians don't really realise it's odd because they just see it as something that is done. But I can't think of another country that has that kind of almost rite of passage.
I should say it's a wonderful thing too that young people on Anzac Day have over the years gotten a bit of a bagging from the people back home. And I want to come on the record right now as saying I have never seen a young person at Gallipoli do anything disrespectful or anything wrong. Yes, they tend to lie around a bit because they're sleepy because they've been up all night. But
I can relate to that.
I have seen young people wiping the dirt off headstones, tenderly. That's the word. I saw a young girl who was probably 19 kneel down at a headstone, and I think a lawnmower had come through earlier in the day and put some dust up on the headstone, and she lay down and she tenderly with her bare hand wiped the dust off the headstone so that the name of the soldier could be revealed. So I've seen young people be nothing but respectful, and I have a huge amount of time for the young people that go to Gallipoli for Anzac Day. So if you're listening to this, if you're sitting home in Australia and you've never been to Anzac Day at Gallipoli, don't fall into that trap of thinking the young people are being disrespectful, because it's the opposite. They're paying thousands of dollars and coming from the far side of the world to go and remember these men. So it's a wonderful thing we should all be very proud of. And you'll see them there in their thousands on Anzac Day. The interesting thing about North Beach is that even though it's where we commemorate Anzac Day, obviously the focus is Anzac Cove, but North Beach was much busier during the campaign than Anzac Cove. Anzac Cove was tiny, it was cramped, and after the opening days, as the front line pushed a little bit further inland and North Beach became a bit safer, North Beach became the prominent base in the Anzac sector because it was just big, it was large. They could build dugouts and hospitals and storage dumps and everything they needed to have an army. Because that's what we got to remember. An army came ashore at Gallipoli. The beachhead was tiny. The entire battlefield was tiny. They never really the whole time it was really just a beachhead they established. Unlike Normandy, where they pushed inland very quickly. At Gallipoli, they never really left the beaches, and so imagine trying to cram an army into the tiny space of Anzac Cove. It's why they needed space like North Beach. The other thing I was going to say is that unlike at Anzac Cove, when the soldiers came ashore at North Beach during the landing, some soldiers did land at North Beach on the day of the landing, and the Turks were ready for them, and it was daylight. And so when we talk about heavy casualties, those occurred at North Beach, not at Anzac Cove. And I've got a quote here from the official history which just describes what the unfortunate men who came ashore at North Beach faced. So, before the boats left the destroyers Bullets were rattling against the high bows of the warships. The rowing boats were under heavy fire all the way to the shore, and as the foremost of them reached the land, the first Turkish shells came singing over. Bullet after bullet went home among the men in the crowded boats. In one, 6 were hit before reaching the shore, and 2 more as they clambered from the boat. So if you think about that, 8 men hit in one boat. There's probably only 20 men in a boat. So if you think that 8 men have been hit by bullets before you've even left the boat, that's a pretty high percentage of the blokes in your little boat. So a lot of men were killed as they came ashore at North Beach. That was quite a horrific part of the landing.
So this is where we get that double story, isn't it? We get we talk about the initial landings, and that's what everybody kind of concentrates on. But this is where we get the real horror of the men trying to get out of boats, struggling in now full daylight, and trying to get up a much more open beach. And it would have been terrible. It would have been a disaster if everybody had actually ended up on this beach, on North Beach. But luckily, it becomes safe after the August when we get the landings at Suvla Bay, which is a little bit further around the peninsula, and they push the Turks back a bit, which at last means that we can get this absolute hive of activity, as Matt said, just extraordinary. Lots and lots of quays, wooden jetties being built out into the sea using packing cases, etc. And yeah, so a very, very busy place. Just extraordinary. You need to look at some photographs of what it was like to try and get an idea, but even then, they don't do it justice. It would be like being in a football game almost, not in the game, in the crowd waiting to go in. There would have been so many people on that beach, people coming down to swim and relax, people bringing supplies up and down, going up the gullies and up to danger. But yet all the time, the Turks are just above you, almost above you, looking down on you. So it was never totally safe, but certainly safer than the initial landings. One of the famous sites that we often point out when we're on this beach is something called Fisherman's Hut, which is a little bit further on North Beach, so going further north. And Fisherman's Hut is where the firing came from. And again, we do get accounts of machine guns firing from here, but no machine guns here either. This was just very accurate rifle fire coming from this place called Fisherman's Hut. Now, we need to know, I don't know if you know this, Matt, I may have mentioned it to you, but Fisherman's Hut just recently burnt down. So it's no longer there, but I believe it's being rebuilt. So, because it's a very good point to point out. It is actually there. There is a Fisherman's Hut on the site still, so you can point it out quite easily when you're talking about it. But it's certainly recently burnt down, but I believe they're rebuilding it.
I didn't know that, Pete. That's interesting. As always, it's a pretty rugged landscape there. There's always something going on like that at Gallipoli, unfortunately, but it hasn't changed in over a century. You were mentioning how busy it was and just how much construction work had been done, as you said, after the landings at Suvla Bay, when North Beach became relatively safe. And again, another quote here from Sergeant Cyril Lawrence, who was evacuated sick. He left before the August offensives and came back after the August offensives, so he got quite a surprise how much Gallipoli had changed and how busy it now was. And this is what he said. So he expected to land at Anzac Cove from where he had left, but instead he landed on a brand new pier at North Beach. And this is what he said. Once more on old Anzac. What a change. Why, when we left, there was hardly anything round this side of the cove. It was not safe. Now there are tents and a YMCA. And what's that great sandbag mansion going up directly in front of us? A post office, eh? 80 feet long, 12 feet high and 24 feet wide. Some building. Windows, doors and a counter too. Crikey, they are coming on in these parts. So you just see that's a big building. An 80-foot long post office just to handle the mail coming in and out from Gallipoli. So just extraordinary and unexpected. And when you go there today, and obviously it's just a long stretch of sand, you can't imagine the hustle and bustle that went on in 1915.
It's amazing, and I always find it interesting that when you look down, if you walk, because people often wonder what the actual beach is like. Well, it's actually quite pebbly in some areas, so we get pebbles and a mixture of some sand. So it's one of those mixed beaches, and there's still the odd thing. I have these interesting relics, and you can walk on the beach looking down, and there's bits of rum jar. That's probably the most common thing you can see. Little bits of the old SRD, the jars that held the rum. You'll find those being washed about in the surf. So it's still there. And that's the great part of it. Leave it there. We always leave everything there on the peninsula because it needs to remain there. But it's an extraordinary place to walk just along this little bit of beach, knowing that so many people were once here in this same area.
The other important thing about North Beach before we move on is this was where most men evacuated from. When we talk about the Gallipoli evacuation, the vast number of men left from North Beach because this was the main thoroughfare. This was where the piers were. This is where boats could easily get in. Again, Anzac Cove was very cramped, but here they could get into piers, and so most men left from North Beach. So the last view that most men had of Gallipoli was chugging away in a little boat heading out from North Beach at the end of the campaign. And I just wanted to read another quote here. There's going to be a lot of quotes in this because I think Gallipoli in particular, you need to know about it in the words of the men that were there. So I think it really brings it to life. So this is what Lieutenant Harry Moody had to say when he was evacuated late in the campaign. "The Turks have beaten us. Tonight's the last night at Anzac. It hurts to have to leave that place. I was undoubtedly sick of it and needed a rest, but to absolutely chuck the whole thing in cuts right in. And I'm damned if they can say the Australians failed to do what was asked of them. They did everything, more than they were asked. We feel it very much, believe me. We haven't had a fair chance." And that was what Harry Moody had to say as he evacuated and looked back on North Beach as he left. And sadly, he was then killed at Pozières in August the following year. So as many of these men felt that they'd already endured everything they could endure at Gallipoli, then went on to the horrors of the Western Front, and he was killed in August the following year. So only 6 months after having written that, he was unfortunately lying in the fields of France. So it's something we should remember. The ordeal was in many ways yet to come for the men as they left the peninsula.
I always think about the men that left their friends there, those that were dead, and in some cases brothers, so relatives, best friends, guys you joined up with, and they'd been killed and buried in one of the many cemeteries there, and they're having to leave them, and that feeling of not knowing what's going to happen to their graves when they've gone, and I think that must have troubled an awful lot of men that came off the peninsula.
There was one moving account I read of a son writing a letter to his mother, and the line that captured me, I couldn't believe what I was reading. "Dear Mum, Dad was killed today," was the opening line of the letter. So he was serving on the peninsula with his father, and his father was then killed. Extraordinary. And imagine what that must have been like to leave the grave of your father on Gallipoli and evacuate. So so interesting spot, North Beach. It gets quite overlooked to Anzac Cove, but it's a pretty important place. We're going to leave North Beach now. We're going to head south, and we're going to come to Arabunu Cemetery is the first thing we come to, which is the main cemetery. There's one cemetery at each end of Anzac Cove. This is the one at the northern end. Arabunu is the name of the little hill, the little headland that juts out at the north end of Anzac Cove, and as Pete said, Hell Spit is the one at the south. And so this is Arabunu Cemetery. So it was the first cemetery established at Gallipoli when men were buried there on the morning of the landing after they'd been killed in and around the beach. And so this is the spot where men first came ashore. This is the spot where they were buried when they fell on that opening day, and indeed for the rest of the campaign. And so when you stand, it's worth when you go to Arabunu Cemetery, also walk down and stand on the beach in front of Arabunu, because you are then standing right on the spot where the first Australians came ashore on the morning of the landing. Really quite an extraordinary place, Pete.
I love Arabunu Cemetery. Well, I love the Ann Beach Cemetery. These two cemeteries that bracket Anzac Cove. I think they're very special because they feel so immediate. You know that these are true battlefield cemeteries in the sense that they're burying people here almost from day one, and in some cases right the way until, well, no, in both cases almost to the evacuation. So these are constantly being used. Now, they're not safe, and that's the other thing to say, that these cemeteries, in fact, very few cemeteries are safe. These cemeteries are always in danger of random shell fire. What was that gun called? Beachy
Bill.
Beachy Bill, yeah. One of the of several guns that were firing onto the beach. So so burials that took place in these cemeteries were always difficult, but I think Arabunu Cemetery a little safer than Beach Cemetery on the other side of the cove.
Well, George Mitchell was a Lance Corporal, and he came ashore in the first wave, and his account of what it was like to actually land right where you're standing in front of Arabunu was quite remarkable. So I'll tell you how he described the landing. This was when the first shots started ringing out, because they came in silence and they were incredibly nervous. There was a huge amount of tension. They didn't know whether the whole world was going to erupt in front of them. Finally, some rifle fire came from the Turks, and they were actually quite relieved that the battle had begun. So he said, Good, I remember saying, the bastards will give us a go after all. Clock, 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 wee, came the little messages of death. Then it opened up in a terrific chorus. The key was being turned in the lock in the lid of hell. Some men crouched in the crowded boat. Some sat up nonchalantly, some laughed and joked, while others cursed with ferocious delight. Fear was not at home. That was his description of the landing as he came ashore. It sounds a little bit boy's own adventure, but that's how he recalled coming ashore at the landing. And now, of course, when you stand at Arabunu, you stand on that beach, you've got this beautiful cemetery, and there's 252 burials in a cemetery. Because it was a hospital cemetery, because bodies were brought back and typically buried in this cemetery, there's not many unidentified graves. And that's the distinction. In many of these cemeteries in Gallipoli, it's not quite like on the Western Front where there's a lot of unidentified graves. It's a little bit confusing. Some cemeteries are all unidentified graves, but many of them, like this one, there's not many unidentified. So 42 unidentified out of the 252 burials. So there's 149 Australian men buried there. And 82 of those men are from the Light Horse, which is interesting because a lot of the men killed in the Charge of the Neck in August, the famous charge at the Neck depicted in the movie Gallipoli. If these men were wounded, they were brought back down to the beach, and many of them sadly died there. So there's a lot of men from the Light Horse who were killed in the Charge of the Neck, or who died of wounds after that charge, are buried there. So just a lovely cemetery, Pete.
Oh, I love them because they're sheltered as well on a hot day, and you can get under the trees. There's trees in these cemeteries, and they feel nice. Now, what we should say, and we haven't mentioned, is of course these are not the headstones that we've talked about on the Western Front. So if you have ever been to the Western Front and you're thinking of the headstones, then these white Jurassic stone headstones, well, that's not what we have on Gallipoli. It was felt that they were a bit too, I suppose, almost Christian, and because we're in a Muslim country, it was decided that there would be no cross of sacrifice in the sense of what we see here in France or in Europe. The cross would be just on engraved into a wall, so it's a cross that's actually engraved into one of the walls. And the headstones are not headstones; they're just how would you describe them, Matt? They're just
markers. We say markers.
That's a good word. Yeah.
They're just it's a small square stone set. Not into the ground. They're not flat in the ground. They're propped up slightly.
Just like the angle.
Yeah, we just call just a slight angle. So we call them markers. They're what you might see in the civilian cemetery in West Wyalong, my hometown. You know, in the lawn cemetery. They're like that. They're like the small markers you'd see in a lawn cemetery in a civilian cemetery back in Australia. So I think they're well done. They do have a little Christian cross on them, and all the information, the same information that you have generally on the ones on the Western Front, but just done a lot more discreetly, as a nod to the nature of the country that they're in.
If anything, it opens up the landscape a bit, doesn't it? Whereas, so you get, in fact, the plants and flowers, because there are flowers, just the same as we get here on the Western Front, and so they're very, very beautiful. And without the headstones, it means that you get a bit more of a vista of a garden. It feels a little bit more like a garden to me when we go into the cemeteries on the peninsula.
Yeah, it's a lovely spot. We should also mention, too, when we're talking about the landing in Arabunu Cemetery, that there's a connection with where you are sitting right there, Pete, because Lieutenant Duncan Chapman from Maryborough in Queensland is considered the first man to have stepped out of the first boat. As much as we know, he was the first man ashore at Gallipoli, and he was killed at Pozières. Again, another sad tale, a man killed at Pozières, and he's buried at Pozières British Cemetery just down the road from where you are sitting at the moment, Pete.
His body recovered in, I was looking up before the podcast, I always try and get my notes up to date, so recovered in 1919. It's a grave that I take people to on the Western Front when we're touring here. A lot of debate over the years as to whether he was the first guy, but I think he's now fairly much been recognised as the first guy, and in fact his hometown... how am I going to say that?
Maryborough.
Thank you. Maryborough. That's how it looks for a change. I normally get the pronunciation of Australian towns wrong. So Maryborough, has just recently, fairly recently, raised a memorial to him. So there's now a bronze statue of him in his hometown as well.
As far as we can tell, he was the first man ashore. Yeah. So we'll never know definitively, but he's representative of those first men ashore. So
I'm not so sure it really matters, but it is interesting. Yeah,
he definitely was in the first wave. He was an officer in the first boats to come ashore, so it's highly likely he would have led his men ashore. So he's a good representative. But yeah, there's a connection there always to the Western Front. So there's other notable graves, of course, in Arabunu Cemetery. My Gallipoli relative, I have one relative who was killed at Gallipoli. He is buried in Arabunu. and so Watty Barber is his name, Alexander Watt Barber. And so Watty, he was known to his friends. And my great uncle, who served on the Western Front, had a little book with signatures in it, and Watty Barber's signature is in that before he went off to Gallipoli. He was killed. He was in the light horse, but he was killed before the charge at the neck. He was killed by a grenade up on Russell's Top. So he's buried there. But also there's some Muslim men from the Indian Mule Corps are buried there, and their graves face Mecca. There's a number of Australians who served with New Zealand units and New Zealanders who served with Australian units. Just quite an interesting mix of men in this cemetery. There's even a grave from the Maltese Labour Corps. You don't often think of that, but labourer Giuseppe Camilleri of the Maltese Labour Corps is buried here as well. So Egyptian and Maltese labourers were brought in to assist after the August campaign just with construction jobs, and sadly he was killed just before the evacuation. So interesting spot.
I went to go and have a look at him last time I was there. I was just interested in his story. And I have a little bit of an interest in Maltese serving on the Western Front in the Australian forces. Some of you may know the story of the Maltese that sailed from Malta to Australia to try and enlist in the Australian forces. And it's because they didn't want to join the Labour Corps. They wanted to fight because effectively Malta was its major force was going to be Labour during the Great War, and they didn't want to serve as labourers. They wanted to serve as infantrymen, so they decided to sail to Australia. It was a fairly long old journey, and they got darker and darker as they travelled across the sea. And eventually, when they arrived in Australia, they were turned away because of the white-only policy. They said they couldn't enlist because they were too black. So a very sad little story. And I suppose lots of you are going to be thinking, I wonder where they went, and I have no idea what happened to them after that. But these guys had paid for the trip themselves and hired a boat so they could join the Australian forces, and sadly turned away.
Just extraordinary. I didn't know that story, Pete. It's always great learning something new on these podcasts with you. What we're going to do now is we're going to walk out of the cemetery, and there's some steps that lead down onto the beach. This is, of course, Anzac Cove, the famous Anzac Cove. We won't. I don't think we'll actually linger too long. On the story of Anzac Cove, everyone knows it inside and out. I'll read a quote from Charles Bean from the official history about what Anzac Cove was like. Busy is the answer. It was usually just called the beach to people. It was officially known as Anzac Cove, and it was named that during the campaign. But if you ever spoke to a veteran, it was just called the beach. The sector was known as Anzac. In fact, they often referred to the entire Gallipoli campaign as Anzac. So if you see a reference to Anzac, they're referring to the fact that they served at Gallipoli. And usually they just called it the beach. That was what it was known as.
I think it was General Birdwood that actually suggested that it should be known as Anzac Cove. I think that was his suggestion. But you're right. Most soldiers just knew it as the beach.
Again, the formality of the officers versus the casualness of the men. To the commanding general, it's Anzac Cove. To the men on, it's just the beach. I mean, see you, cobber. I'm heading down to the beach. So this is the description of what it was like. But as I said, the answer is busy if you ask the question of what Anzac Cove was like, particularly before August, when it was the only place that they could come ashore in the whole Anzac sector. This is how Charles Bean described it. When the struggle of the landing had subsided, the beach on summer days reminded many onlookers of an Australian coastal holiday place. The shoreline itself resembled rather an old-time port, with its crowded barges, often beached to prevent being sunk, a few short piers, piles of biscuit boxes and fodder stacked behind, the smell of rope, of tar, of wet wood, of cheese and other cargo. But in the water, the hundreds of bathers, and on the hillside, the little tracks winding through the low scrub irresistibly recalled the Manly of New South Wales or the Victorian Sorrento, while the sleepy tick-tock of rifles from behind the hills suggested the assiduous practice of batsmen at their nets on some neighbouring cricket field.
That's just a fantastic
He did love a good wander off into prose, didn't he, the old Charles Bean? But what a great description. So this was, as we said before August, this was the main area of operations for the Anzacs coming ashore and waging a war. Just quite extraordinary.
I think what's sad now is it's so difficult to get to. I mean, the only real way we can get to it is by using these stairs at the back of the cemetery and walking down onto the beach, because I'm sure you were going to talk about it, Matt, but the building of the road and the sea defences, because effectively to stop the road being washed out, they had to build sea defences, which effectively was a big wall. has meant that the whole of the Cove itself has changed beyond recognition. Really, it's completely been. Well, some people say destroyed. I'm not quite. I'd go quite that far, because in a way it's been preserved, because there is bad erosion in the area, and if it had been left without the wall, then slowly but surely the beach and the area would have been eroded anyway. But it has changed it dramatically, and it means that you can no longer walk off the beach as the men would have done. You have to go to the left rail and up through the cemetery. There's no other way of getting off the beach easily.
Let's talk about the roadworks, because over my career I've been diplomatic about them, and in my book I said, they were controversial, but bugger that. We're all friends here. We're all listening. Let's tell it as it was. Here's the story. 2005, just before the 90th anniversary of the landing, in the months before Anzac Day, someone from the government, and it was the Howard government, I'm even going to call it out, someone from the government, the most sophisticated work of political arse covering I've ever seen took place after this. Someone from the Howard government went to Gallipoli and decided that the road that leads to the commemorative site at North Beach, which obviously goes past Anzac Cove, that road was not wide enough, was not big enough, was not up to the standard of carrying all the coaches that were going to come for the 90th anniversary. So put in a rather vague request to the Turkish government that they do something about it. The Turks, a couple of things going on. I love the Turkish people, but sometimes they can be their own worst enemy when it comes to history and preserving their history. No offence to anyone from Turkey, but I think you'd admit that occasionally things go a little bit wrong. The Turks, wanting to do the right thing, basically sent in the bulldozers, and they ploughed. Basically, they removed the entire cliffside over Anzac Cove and to widen the road. You couldn't widen it in the other direction because it was facing the ocean. So they basically just ploughed away the entire cliffside above Anzac Cove. And it must be said, did a fairly dodgy job on the whole thing. It was not properly... They built a brand new road just in time for Anzac Day, which for the couple of days of Anzac Day served the coach as well. But then the whole thing started to go wrong. It just hadn't been properly built, and it started to collapse and fall into the sea. And so now we had this disastrous situation where the only road leading to the commemorative site was now in danger of collapsing completely. And so then, again, in consultation with Australians and Turks and everything else, they just had to do major engineering work to try and shore the whole thing up, which is still going on to this day. And the whole thing just made the roadway and the whole surface and the whole slope unstable. And so ever since 2005, its determination is to slide into the ocean. That's what it wants to do. The road wants to collapse into the ocean. And so consequently, maybe 10 years ago, 6 or 7, 8 years ago, they built along the entire length of Anzac Cove a 6-foot-high rubble seawall to shore up the whole terrible mess, permanently altering the entire landscape of Gallipoli forever. The most important part of Gallipoli is now unrecognisable. If any man was teleported back from 1915 to today, he would absolutely not recognise anything to do with it. So you've got a combination of the massive, ugly, scarred slope above the beach where they bulldozed the wall, where they bulldozed the slope to widen the road, and the terrible, awful seawall. The seawall itself now keeps collapsing and falling into the sea, and it's just a shambles. So as I said, the greatest act of political arse covering that I've ever seen took place, whereas the Australian government in 2005 tried to distance itself from the fact that they'd been the ones that asked for the roadworks to be done. Just such a shame, and an incredible mismanagement on both sides of the ocean of a landscape that should have been preserved. I think part of the issue is that the commemorative site has now been the focal point for Anzac Day, because it's this big purpose-built, setup around the corner. And I think that's taken away from the importance of Anzac Cove, which is just a little curved bay now. So I think in some ways the focus is on the wrong area. Anyway, I will get off my high horse now, but it was a tragedy, and I just can't believe every time I go to Anzac Cove, it's almost not worth going. What we do when we take groups there now is we go to Ariburnoo Cemetery and then we walk down onto Anzac Cove just so we can say we've been there. But there's no point. There's no point in taking a photo to then and now photo. It just does not look the same. It's a real tragedy.
The saving grace, I suppose, is there's so much of the battlefield which is preserved everywhere. If that had been it and there'd been nothing else, then it would have been just the biggest disaster you can imagine. And even though it is a disaster that we no longer have that feel of the landing, we no longer walk in the footsteps of the men in that area, but at least we don't have to go far before we are back in their footsteps again. So there is that, thankfully. I like your comment, Matt, about the actual commemorative site, because it's interesting, isn't it? How many people in the future, especially when they come whistling through on coaches, will go to the commemorative site and actually then think, right, this is the be all and end all. This is where we need to go. We've said we've now done it. We've done Anzac. We can move off and carry on. And that is a little bit, reminds me a bit about the Battle of Waterloo site. The Waterloo site, people tend to go to the visitor centres and to the Butte de Lyon, which was built after the battle, and they don't go onto the battlefield. So in fact, when they say that I visited Waterloo, no, you haven't. You visited the visitor centre and a few of the sites around the visitor centre. You haven't walked on the battlefield at all. You've not been on the battlefield. And so I think that's an interesting aspect of, if you get people to go to a certain spot and nowhere else, then they've not really been. They've just been to a site that commemorates it, but is not the site itself.
When we leave Anzac Cove and head back up the stairs, we go to a memorial that is very famous, very well known, which was the words supposedly spoken by Ataturk in 1934. And Kemal Ataturk, the father of the Turks, the founder of modern Turkey, he became a made man at Gallipoli. He was a colonel in a Turkish regiment, and he was responsible in many ways for holding back, particularly in the opening days, holding back the Allies, and it really made him as a man and led to this great political career where he was the founder of modern Turkey. And there's a large memorial to him with the words that he supposedly wrote. People have said more recently that he probably didn't write those words, but it doesn't matter. These words were attributed to him. He was the leader of the country. He was a politician. And so words written in his name are just as important as words he actually spoke himself. But it's worth repeating here what he said, because it's touching and sums up the relationship between Turkey and Australia now, and New Zealand, of course, and the UK. Those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives, you are now lying in the soil of a friendly country. Therefore, rest in peace. There is no difference between the Johnnies and the Mehmets, so that's the Allies and the Turks, to us, where they lie side by side here in this country of ours. You, the mothers who sent their sons away from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now lying in our bosom and are in peace. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well. And I'm not quite sure that the men who bled their last out on the slopes of Gallipoli or faced the Turks in savage combat would have felt that sentiment at the time. But it is how the Gallipoli campaign has come. It has forged this really strong bond between Australia and Turkey. It's a really quite remarkable thing, Pete, just the bond between the two countries now. We should be enemies. You can't imagine the French and the Germans getting together to have a good chat and a laugh about D-Day. But the Turks and the Anzacs are, we've just forged this very strong bond between the two countries.
Yes, I agree. I've always been a little uncomfortable with how Ataturk, fantastic politician. I mean, he basically is the guy that created modern Turkey, sadly, which is going the other direction at the moment. We won't get into modern politics, but he's a fascinating guy and a very, very clever guy. And when he spoke those words in 1934, I don't think it matters, as you said, whether he wrote them himself or not. They're important, and they're important in bringing Turkey into part of I suppose, Europeanizing Turkey, which is what he wanted. He wanted a secular country that was going to become part of a growing Europe. And so, he's a clever man, and it does lead to this, in time, to this, connection between Australia and as probably even more so New Zealand and Turkey. But if you read about the fighting and the treatment of prisoners during the war, I think we have to be careful that we don't overdo this fact that everybody was buddy when they weren't fighting. The Turkish treatment of prisoners was not good. Many prisoners were executed having been captured. So I do think we just have to be careful when we think about this and don't perceive that everything was nice and they were always mates. When they finished fighting, they were mates. Well, in some cases they were. In some cases they most definitely were not. I suppose it's the same in any war. But I've always just felt just a little uncomfortable that I don't like people thinking that it was such a relationship with Turkey at the time and just after the war. It's developed over a long period of time. And it's great. I mean, I'm all for these kind of live and let live, and let's forget about what happened in the past. But I think we have to remember that it wasn't a particularly pleasant experience fighting the Turks, I don't think.
Pete, it's a great point. We should never... There is a desire in modern times, when we look back on warfare, to try and find the romanticism and the humanity in it, because we just can't deal with the ghastliness. That's human nature. We don't want to think about how keen we were to chop people's heads off and bayonet them and blow them up. And so we try to find those elements, which did exist. It wasn't the case that it was all brutality. There were moments of humanity there as well. So we tend to latch onto those because it makes us feel better about what went on. I think it's in many ways it's fascinating. Studying warfare is looking in a mirror at the very darkest, the darkest deeds that humans can ever undertake, and it scares us. We don't like thinking that I could have been the same. I could have been that young bloke who 1 minute was working in a bookshop in Glebe in Sydney, and then the next minute I was bayoneting a Turk on the beaches of Gallipoli. So we don't like it. So we do look for those moments of humanity to try and make it all make sense and to try and understand. I think the other important thing that I always say to people always say, isn't it very gracious of the Turks to let us come and commemorate? And and we invaded their country. The whole concept of it was invasion of Turkey is well overblown. It was absolutely not an invasion of Turkey. It was quite a strategic move to capture a very strategic plot of land. It was not a wholesale invasion of Turkey. In the way that we think of an invasion like the Nazis invading France. But people say, isn't it gracious of the Turks that they let us come? And there's a really important thing to remember here. The Turks absolutely won the battle, but they lost the war. And Ataturk said there had never been a country more defeated than the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War. We absolutely smashed them in the war. And to the victors go the spoils. So we were able to come back and occupy the country that we had not succeeded in overcoming during the war. So we should always remember that. Again, nothing away from Turkey, but we should remember that yes, we lost the Gallipoli campaign, but we absolutely won the war, and we were then able to to decide how Gallipoli should be remembered from that point going forward. So it's a joint effort, is what I would say. It's a joint effort between all of the countries who were involved to remember, and the Turks are very, very good at remembering what went on there, and for as you said, it's changing slightly now, but in general have been great at just remembering and commemorating, and it's a shared experience. Pete, I think what we will do is, we've already been going for over an hour. I think we should come back to this. I think Pete and I discussed whether we would do this in 2 parts because we knew it was going to be big, and I think we absolutely should do that. So let's do the last site, which will be Aribonu, the peninsula itself, the headland itself, and then we'll come back next week to finish our walk, because there's more. I don't want to rush it, and there's more to say. So we'll finish the walk this week, halfway along the walk of the landing beaches, by scrambling up Aribonu, which is the headland which overlooks Anzac Cove at the northern end. And the reason it's important is this was where the first Anzacs scrambled up. The Aussies that came ashore, they hit the beach right in front of what is now the cemetery. They went across the land that is now the cemetery, and then they scrambled up this low headland called Aribonu. And you can do it yourself. You can, not the same way they did because you can't get up from the beach, but you can walk back up from the cemetery to the road, and you can scramble up the side. And I did it the first time I was there. We did it, Pete, in 2013.
Yeah.
It's well worth doing.
I've written in my notes, worth a scramble.
Worth the scramble. It is a bit of a scramble, and you have to do it the same way the Anzacs did. You have to grab onto tufts of scrub and haul yourself up, but it's well worth doing. When you get to the top, there is a trench there, which was originally a Turkish trench, but also you would have to say probably enhanced during the campaign, particularly during the evacuation, because this whole area, they knew if there was a Turkish breakthrough during the evacuation, this whole area was going to be the last stand on the peninsula, effectively. And so, so some of these trenches would have been built by the Turks, but probably improved by the Anzacs. But let's hear Major Aubrey Darnell describe the charge up Aribonu. So it's probably a fitting spot to end. On the day of the landing, here's what he experienced in your footsteps as you scramble up this slope. A brief pause on the beach to fix bayonets, much swearing and cheering, and we charged up a hill so steep in places we could only just scramble up. No firing, all bayonet work. Now, this is interesting what he says. Clean over a machine gun we went. Men dropped all around me. It was mad, wild, thrilling. Not till I was near the top of the hill did I realise that in the excitement, I hadn't even drawn my revolver. Fascinating one. So he said they saw a machine gun. They claimed they saw a machine gun. But we know that there were not machine guns there. It's definitively been proven now there were not machine guns there for a couple of reasons. Firstly, we've now read the Turkish accounts. I haven't personally, but historians much more adept than me have read the Turkish accounts and have read the returns from the units that were involved, and none of them were equipped with machine guns. But most importantly, the logic test. This is the one that always crosses me. They say, clean over a machine gun, we went. That's what he says. So if that was the case, what would have happened? That gun would have been captured. That machine gun would have been captured. It would have been marked up, labelled, and sent back as a trophy, as a war trophy. They would have sent it back to investigate, to examine, to pull apart, to find out how the Turks were armed. It would have been listed as something that was captured, and not a single machine gun was listed as being captured from the Turks for the opening weeks of the campaign. So that says to me pretty definitively that there were no machine guns there at Anzac Cove.
You could imagine, though, can't you, how easy it was to believe that? Because I'm fairly certain that this guy would not actually, outright lie. There were machine guns firing, but of course they were our machine guns firing from the lighters, so you could hear machine guns firing, and the men at that time wouldn't be really used to different machine gun noises, so they wouldn't know. They could just hear machine guns. And you can imagine in the half light as he's scrambling up that bank and he sees two Turks, let's say, slumped over something, and he just bounds over them. Then he would just, in his mind, I've just cleared a machine gun. I've just gone over the top of a machine gun. So I think it's very easy to imagine how the men themselves, and certainly as these stories then it went on and on with more and more people talking about machine guns. Oh, well, that must have been a machine gun. I climbed over a machine gun as I was advancing. So, yeah.
Plus, that was in his diary, which he may have written 2 weeks after the landing, and he would have seen it. And he would have seen an awful lot of machine guns. They saw lots of machine guns on the first day. Within hours of the landing, they were coming under very heavy machine gun fire as Turkish reinforcements came up. So he would have been used to a lot of machine guns firing at him. If he'd written that a week or two after the landing. So yeah, it's understandable. And of course, even just rapid fire, 150 men firing their rifles at the same time. Rapid fire of rifles is going to give that impression, but. That's probably a good spot to finish this opening chapter of the landing, because we're standing in the Turkish trenches overlooking Anzac Cove, in the spot where the very first Turks would have seen that armada of small boats coming in. A good spot to pause and just think about that landing and what went on from that point. It would have been a pretty scary notion to turn to your mate and say, "What's that coming in?"
I have to say, you need to pause there, because normally when you've got up to the top, you're very out of breath. It's a steep old climb and difficult. And if you had a rifle in one hand as well as you were climbing and your equipment on, then yeah, even more difficult. But it is a great place to stop and look back out into the sea and imagine what the Turks would have seen in that half light as they saw the boats approaching the beach. And so saying, I'd quite like to walk back down again and go for a swim now, I think.
If you're there in August, which a lot of people are, July or August, that's certainly on the cards. When I was a younger man, I a couple of times when I was at Gallipoli, I did exactly what the Anzacs did. I also went up the side of Pluggy's Plateau from Arabunu, which we'll get to later on. That's the next big slope, and that's 3 or 4 times higher than Arabunu. So you've got to be, I wouldn't do that these days, but you've got to be pretty keen to do that one. But I did that in my first couple of visits as well. So it's a wonderful spot. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this first half of our walk along the landing beaches, and please join us next week when we continue the walk further along Anzac Cove, up into Shrapnel Valley, up past Brighton Beach, and really walking in the footsteps of the Anzacs in those opening days of the campaign. Pete, thank you so much for joining me as always, and I look forward to continuing the journey next week.
Pleasure. Can't wait for next week and carry on the story.